Thanks everyone. Oops, sorry, that was last. Going to start. Delighted to welcome you today, Chelsea and Krystal. I've been asked to say Chelsea in the shortest shell of answers and Krystal in the close answers. So Chelsea Liang is a health security policy researcher at Good and Assisted Policy, a charity that seeks to engage all levels of government and civil society for the biggest challenges of the century. They actually created a bespoke and concrete set of pandemic preparedness policy papers tailored to meet the current Australian legal, bureaucratic, and scientific infrastructure. This work is supported by an Open Philanthropy grant. Krystal is a co-founder of Policy Foundry, a policy development unit that provides high-quality policy proposals for advocates on the most important 21st century global challenges. Previously, she worked at the Grand Institute, economic consultancy, and the Victorian Department of Treasury and Finance. She's currently an economics honours student at Monash University. And please, throughout the session, enter your questions in the swap card using the live discussion. And please give a warm welcome to Chelsea and Krystal.
Welcome to the Australian and Policy Careers section. So yeah, like we've said, I'm Krystal, this is Chelsea. Yeah, it's really great to meet you all, and Chelsea and I are super chuffed that you guys have come, especially since this conference program is really jam-packed, so we really appreciate it. We just figure out how to change slides.
I think it might be Zoom. Oh, okay,
that works.
that works.
Yeah. Yeah, so I wanted to just start by doing a throwback to EAGx 2022. So this is a picture of a policy panel last year during the conference. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a picture of all three speakers together, so you have my terrible face job there. There's Risto's knee and Michael's. So they were sitting together. And they were talking about, oh, should we do Australian policy work? What would that look like? But in July 2022, this was all theoretical, and cut to this year's conference, and you might have noticed that the agenda has a lot more policy work in it and a lot more Australian policy work. And that's really cool. And I guess part of what this talk is trying to answer is that question of, well, in that intervening time, what's happened? How have all these organisations come up? And also, how can you get involved? So yeah, like I said, this talk is designed to answer that question, and we'll run through a bit about looking at what policy is, and then we'll get into more EA perspectives about whether or not it's worth doing EA-aligned policy in Australia, the potential impact of focusing on Australian policy work, how you can test your fit for that kind of policy work, and then finally, what does it look like to actually get involved and what are the routes to impact? So a couple things to keep in mind before we get into it. This is a collection of thinking from Chelsea and I after working full-time in this space for about a year. So we don't intend for this to at all be the final word on anything, and we're not necessarily advocating for you to do Australian EA-aligned policy work. We're just hoping that we can give you some of the frameworks to think about this space, and that you can use those to think about whether or not you actually want to get more involved. If you're already from a policy background, some of this talk might be familiar to you, and also just add another caveat that Chelsea and I both come from more of the long-termist policy research side of things, so this talk will be more biased towards that perspective.
Okay. Yep. Let's start with our first framing question. What is policy? With this talk, we're kind of framing policy as, where you fit into this process in terms of career or contributions. As such, I think it's going to be helpful to divide policy up into various functions that are carried out by policy people. Okay, if you characterize policy as a collection of actions, there's roughly 4 types. There's forming the basis for advice, giving advice, deciding what advice is followed, and implementing advice. I'll use examples of work that's been done here in Australia in just last year to give a bit of context about what I mean by these functions. Yeah, the question kind of at the center of forming a basis for advice is something like, where are we currently? Why are we in this situation? And as effective altruists, we love thinking about prioritization and comparative advantage. So this is from the question here. What policy should we prioritize in the Australian context? Policy boundary. Love the logo, by the way. I've never said that to you, but I mean, you can know this now. Has been doing a lot of work, in Australia. Their policy scans have done work assessing what existing policy Australia has on these issues. Issues that effective altruists care about, like pandemic preparedness, but also issues that we may have a comparative advantage with, like food security, or how risk management or extreme risks is conducted. Yeah, giving advice. So I think this question at the center of this is, how might we get from here, this status quo, this situation, to where we want to go? And then when advice is given, there's usually a specific jurisdiction or context or recipient advice is given to. In 2023, our community has been giving advice in sort of two forms. One is, I guess, playing that inside game that Greg has talked about, working with ministers in public service on the example I'll give is the national risk assessment process. I don't know if Ben is in the audience, shout out to Ben for doing that. Yeah, a workshop was run on the subject, and a report was written to summarize its recommendations, so you can read that. And yeah, Good Answers Policy and Effective Outcome Australia collaborated on a organisational submission. This is yet another avenue to give advice to the Productivity Commission's philanthropy inquiry. The submission highlighted shortcomings of charity law, as Greg so passionately conveyed, and proposed some recommendations. Deciding what advice is followed. The question here is sort of, where do we want to go? What advice can we follow? And do we expect that to align with our goals? Still on the slide with Greg and Gap to describe the framework of inside-outside game, and in this case, in the context of deciding policy. So yeah, inside government, you have the people you think are making all the decisions. Senators, MPs, political staffers, public servants. However, a member of civil society can, in part, also decide what policies are followed through public pressure and electoral influence on these people inside government. So regardless of if you ever have a career in capital P policy, this path is open. And last but not least, the question at the center of implementing advice is, what changes can be made in the real world to enact this advice policy? In terms of the Australian EA policy community implementing policy, I can't really point to anyone directly, mostly because policy is slow, it's literally only been a year. But what I can point to is an early action by Andrew Lee. He's been a champion for the Australian Centre for Valuation and the Australian Treasury. And a tidbit I will share from the media release is the Australian Centre for Valuation champion high quality impact evaluations, such as randomized control trials. We know what they're about for the lots of good randomized control trial. Yeah, so now that we've looked into what policy is.
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. Yeah, so I'll talk a bit more about whether or not you should do policy work. And I want to split this into two broad considerations. checking my slides working, cool. Yeah, so the first is the impact. I think the first question you should ask is policy work the most impactful thing that you can do in your career? And to start with, it's important to consider whether or not you should do policy work in the first place. I think EA in general as a movement has been pretty slow to get onto the policy train. And that's because we like to think from first principles, we like to think very in-depth about things. But that's changed in recent years, and I would say broadly for two reasons. One is because government is often a really crucial stakeholder in a lot of different cause areas, and therefore have to influence government to actually be able to create the change that you want. But the second is also that government is, and policy work in general, is a really good way of doing things at scale, which is also one of the things that EAs care a lot about. There are a lot of reasons that, that being said, that like policy work might not be as impactful, depending on what you think is generally the most important cause area to work on. That can be because of various kinds of downside risks. It's a lot less relevant for some cause areas or niches within cause areas. And the other thing to keep in mind is policy can give very transferable skills. And I think if you're already working in policy, it can be easy to think that, oh, okay, well, I guess I'll think about how I can have impact through a policy career. But I also encourage you to think about other avenues for impact. And yeah, I won't get into that too much further in today's talk, but Chelsea and I have linked a couple of resources at the end of these slides that will be sent out after the conference. And I encourage you to have a look at those to have a think as well about whether or not you should stick with policy and the different downside risks. Cool. So the second thing to consider in impacting policy work is, from an EA perspective, is working on Australian policy work the thing to do to maximise your impact. I think yesterday's keynote highlighted some of the pros and cons, and I'll just go over them very quickly. I think the key reason why there's a lot of skepticism in the EA community about Australian policy work is because Australian is like a middle power country. Like the reality is that we're not the country that's the most powerful in a lot of cause areas. We don't have the frontier AI tech labs. We're not a nuclear power. We're not the country controlling a lot of the crucial technologies that influence these cause areas. And I think that simple but very real fact is something important to keep in mind, not just because it means that your policy impact could be really different depending on whether you're working on Australian policy or say US or UK policy, but also because that's the narrative that a lot of funders have in mind. And so if you really want to get funding to do this Australian policy work, you have to be able to present a narrative that's persuasive enough to overcome that narrative that funders have about the value of Australian policy work. And then on the other side, in terms of the pros, there's the idea that every country's policy is important because every country has to decide how to regulate frontier technologies. Every country is contributing and shaping global markets and global norms, and therefore every country needs to play a part in implementing policies that will mitigate and help address the cause areas that we care about. And I think linked to this is the idea that Australian policy work can be impactful because we can learn and export. So this table comes from a great EA Forum article that I recommend you guys check out. It's called "Why Scale is Overrated: The Case for Increasing EA Policy Efforts in Smaller Countries." And its core argument is encapsulated in that bottom right corner there. Basically, the idea is that policy work in smaller countries can be good test labs for experimental policies due to low downside risk, which is the learning part. And then these countries can then export these policies to other countries. That's the exporting part of the learn and export. And the key advantage of doing policy work in smaller countries is that it's generally easier to create influence. Essentially, it's easier to be a big fish in a small pond where our bureaucracies and political systems are just smaller and therefore easier to rise up in. And if we believe in this story, then Australia is particularly well positioned to make an impact for several reasons. Strategically, we're located in the Asia Pacific, which is central theatre of geopolitics this century. We've got really strong relationships with the US and the UK at all levels of government, including the public service, which means when we implement a policy, it's more likely that governments in those countries will stand up, notice, and consider implementing it in their own countries. And we've got a history of world-leading reform. So some recent examples include our recent news media bargaining code, which regulates big tech, has been adopted in Canada and has been considered in other countries as well. And our laws to prevent foreign interference have also been adopted elsewhere. Other reasons why you might think Australian policy work is particularly impactful: we have really strong institutions. So research produced by the Australian Public Service, Australian universities, is likely to be pretty high quality. And if you particularly care about the existential part of existential risk, we're an island in the middle of nowhere and therefore an ideal location for refuge, which could make improving resilience to risks here particularly influential. And I think the key question here is whether or not you think these potential upsides outweigh the downsides of the fact that in most, if not all policy areas, we're not the most influential country. But I also want to talk about this from another perspective. I think instead of thinking in the abstract of the value of Australian policy work versus overseas policy work, it's useful instead to consider the impact of working on specific policy interventions and compare that to whatever the next career option you have is. So here are some examples of specific policy work. I won't go into all of them in detail, but at Policy Foundry, for example, we've conducted a landscape scan of promising cause areas to work on in an Australian policy context. And within those cause areas, we've identified specific opportunities for policy engagement or policy research that could be particularly high impact. And so I think the key here is to really do your research. I came up with some policy research opportunities when I was part of Policy Foundry, but there are a lot of things there are a lot of areas that I didn't know that Australia could be influential in until I was talking to people in international policy organisations who generally did zero Australian policy work, but when they heard about what Policy Foundry did, they'd be like, oh, actually, it'd be really helpful if Australia on this very niche issue could change its view because they're currently like a particularly important country in this niche. And an example of that is after talking to someone at the DC conference, the EAGxAustralia conference last year, I learned that Australia is a pretty big blocker to new governance on lethal autonomous weapons. And so that could be a really promising area for high impact, but those areas need to be identified. They still need research, they still need someone to think about them really critically and find the best low-hanging fruit. And so, yeah, like I said, I think the key part is to really do your own research. Cool. So now I want to move to the second consideration of whether or not you should do policy, work, which is fit. And to start with, I'll briefly discuss the Australian EA-aligned policy landscape. So here are some organisations in this landscape. You've already heard about Policy Foundry and GAP. Foundations for Tomorrow is a not-for-profit that focuses on future generations governance. They've been around for a while, but only recently focused more on future generations work. And the Institute for Effective Policy does EA-aligned political advocacy. And none of this work existed before 2022. And the only reason it came about is because someone in each of these organisations had an idea and then applied for grants. That was how Policy Foundry started. My co-founder, Ramchan Sapaspo, and I had been tinkering around with some policy and X-risk work for a while. And then early last year, looked into doing more Australian-aligned policy work. And then we applied for a grant. And then that became Policy Foundry. But because of that system, this space is still pretty small. It's mostly project-based. And a lot of the work is also volunteer-driven. And so in terms of what that means for your fit for working directly in this space, I think fundamentally it means that you have to be very comfortable with taking the initiative. There's no clear pipeline to doing EA-aligned policy work, and that's particularly the case if you're doing direct EA policy work where you work for an EA organisation. At this stage, working in this space in Australia might be less stable or be a more uncertain environment than what you're used to, and especially compared to, say, working within a bureaucracy or within an established company. And in that way, I would say it's quite similar to the entrepreneurship or startup space, where you're responsible for a lot more things than you might be usually, whether that's in policy and policy decision making, but also more everyday things like figuring out what information management systems you're going to use and making sure that they work well. And that kind of environment is not for everyone. Even if you're not working in an EA organisation, but trying to make an impact through Australian policy, say through government or through the public service, there's no clear step-by-step guide for how to do it. Instead, a lot of the work, it's about translating and transforming EA frameworks and policy and synthesizing them with models of policy change that already exist, and then using that to create an impact. And the really helpful part in all of that is that the EA community is like very much there to support you, and has really high trust, and people are generally really willing to share ideas and exchange learnings. But it does still underline the fact that it requires a lot of self-initiative, and it requires you to be quite driven to actually make a policy change.
I will also add some thoughts on fit, specifically the skills dimension of personal fit. I think skills are potentially the hardest part of fit to test, mostly because you aren't born with skills, you develop them, and you won't know if you're any good at anything if you don't give it a go. So this is where you to give it a go. And another caveat I will give is that Krystal and I are very much at the start of testing our own personal fit, and probably expect to do so for the rest of this decade. We're currently in the thick of it now, and I think there's maybe a little bit of value to speak to those considerations while we're kind of like literally like tossing it around, thinking about it in our heads. Yeah, I'll first begin with some general fit considerations that apply to all of the policy sort of functions that I've described. If you remember anything from this talk about what it's like to work in policy, so I'm going to enlist SpongeBob SquarePants and the power of memes to help us remember. Okay, number one, can you deal with long feedback loops? In policy, your efforts are headspace because there's just so many voices washing around the policy process. A small number of enormous successes account for a large share of the total impact and should hopefully compensate for a large number of failed projects. So doing good policy work on an average day kind of looks like spinning in place and lukewarm progress. No, this creates a challenge. If you aren't seeing success, do you keep pushing forward or do you redirect your efforts elsewhere? Yeah, feedback by default is limited and noisy. And one reason for this is policy success is dependent on policy windows. And a policy window occurs when the entity you're trying to influence now suddenly becomes receptive to your issue. So policy windows can open with little warning, and after they close, the issue is being set for the next file. So when you're doing policy work, if it exists, be vigilant, recognize the opportunities as they appear, push hard for your change before the door closes. And that's a little bit frustrating. Number two, perennial stakeholder management. Policy is about buy-in from other parties, building and maintaining trust. This can look like everything from reading a room to getting people's titles and biographies correct. I've included the fun song because it's a great representation of stakeholder management. SpongeBob sings this to Plankton, who, if you remember, is often a nemesis in the cartoon. Sing with me. Efforts for friends who do stuff together, U is for you and me, and into it anywhere and anytime at all, down here in the people who say. You almost never pick the parties you must work with. So engendering rapport is a skill you just have to get good at. Or at the very least, understanding what other people's values are and explaining how your goals and their goals align. 3, strong written and verbal communication. I've taken this directly from the capabilities of a job description. Policy work is just a bunch of reading stuff, listening to other people talk about stuff, taking all that stuff, digesting it, telling that to yet more other people. So it's one thing to communicate with your peers to understand all the concepts that you understand, but what separates fine policy work from good policy work is being able to talk to like, this includes, ministerial and parliamentary briefings, and engagement with communities and the electorate. Number 4, kind of riffing off Krystal about incorporating EA frameworks. Policy work influenced by effective altruism is anything. You can't read a textbook on it. The best you can do is a couple forum or blog posts. This represents a challenge in squaring EA frameworks with conventional policy frameworks and processes. So, how do you talk about scope and sensitivity in a way that doesn't seem divorced from reality to people, to everyone else in policy who you might need buy-in or mentorship from? So as such, policy work with EA kind of where will require imagination. So that was the general policy fit considerations, and I'll now give an additional fit consideration for each of the 4 policy functions I mentioned earlier. And I'll also include a relevant forum post that you can go read if you're interested. Okay. Starting with considering work to form a basis for advice. I'll lead with explaining this post by Andrew Snyder-Beatty called "Want to Make a Difference in Policy and Governance? Become an expert in something specific and boring." and if you look at the top comment on that post, it begins with, "I think I mostly disagree with this post." To paraphrase that person's point, they list a few people who began with abstract but rigorous AI safety strategy work and have now gone on to be influential in the British government and in key AI roles. So my 2 cents to sort of like square these 2 observations is that impactful policy work in nascent fields is often broad and strategic, whereas impactful policy work in more established fields benefits from narrow and specific work. For example, work on refuges to safeguard humanity in global catastrophic disasters is very nascent. I think the best work that's been done is by folks in New Zealand with ADAPT research. There's still huge policy questions here, like, how do you begin to talk to government levels without being like laughed out of a room? This benefits from broad strategic work. Contrast this to more mature space, like animal welfare. There's already various theories of change here, like corporate lobbying, and this benefits from more narrow and specific work, getting really good at corporate lobbying and maybe market research on consumer preferences. So consider and test if you're more suited to broad strategic work or specific and narrow policy work, or you might find yourself ill-suited to the type of work that most needs to be done in your course area. But considerations for giving advice. Forget national and local policy. Giving any advice is meritless. In policy, you might lock in bad policies, you might accidentally talk about public hazards, you might cause reputational faux pas that damage credibility, and yet you cannot be immobilized by such risks. Otherwise, no policy change will happen at all. So that's the thing you have to live with. Sam Hilton, also known as We Twins, great name, writes a great forum post on this. Yeah, but considerations for deciding what policy is followed. Again, with the exception of, I guess, animal welfare and climate change as mentioned last night in the keynote, EAs tend to care about pretty non-partisan, uncontroversial, nerdy things. And while this is currently true, I think this is an advantage. When no one really has strong opinions, pretty low effort can get policies over the line. And yeah, this tends to happen because there's like no opponents and like EA voices are like the loudest and most obnoxious. And yeah, notably this is the case with the disaster ready fund that Greg mentioned. So I sort of fall in the camp of avoiding making calls as partisan or politicized if they aren't correct. And here are a few forum posts on reflecting on the campaign of Carrot Flynn, who had a congressional bid in Oregon, primarily running a campaign on pandemic prevention. I'm not sure what my kind of like conclusions on that, my personal conclusions are. Also because it's American politics, so I don't know how to think about that. But it's certainly interesting and worth reading if you want to get down that rabbit hole. Okay, fit considerations for implementing advice and policy. So in governments and large international organizations or public-private partnerships that end up implementing policy, if you work within them, chances are 99% of your work is like vaguely tangentially impactful on an EA cost effectiveness estimation. But if you can hold out for that 1%, they might make your whole tenure there worth incredibly impactful. This is because huge organizations don't have goals that match one EA goals. Yeah, so this takes a special kind of person. If you're itching to always be working on the thing that you think is most impactful and do away with bureaucracy, then a long stint here might not be. And yeah, here are two posts from one from Andy Morgan and from New Zealand, and another from the Twins. Yeah, I'll hand over to Chris.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Chelsea. I think we're running a little bit low on time, so I'll very quickly go over some ways to test fit. I think the key thing I want to highlight here is if you're thinking about testing a fit for policy work, start with things that are quicker and easier to do, like doing some targeted reading, like Chelsea's just given you, a couple dozen forum posts to have a look at. We've got some resources at the end of our slides. Definitely use this conference to talk to people and also go to all the really good policy talks. Zan's going to be holding a really good one as well tomorrow, so definitely go to that one. But yeah, definitely book one-on-ones with us or other people that are working on policy and swap card and talk to them about their experiences. Volunteer, and the last thing I really want to highlight is consider working in policy in non-EA orgs. And if you're already working in a policy organisation at the moment, I would definitely check out Impactful Government Careers, which is a blog run by Toby Jolly. He's UK based and he talks about how people in the UK civil service can have a really high impact. And I think a lot of those lessons apply to Australia as well.
Okay, this is we're throwing all these considerations at you. Let's talk briefly about risk impact. Yeah, in the slide deck, which we'll share afterwards, there's also hidden slides that contain more detail on what these routes also might mean for career, not just that. So how do we place these jobs and organization types and players that you might be familiar with in this policy process, and what does impact look like for each of these places? Academia think tanks. Impact here looks like working with people who take your research and take that to decision makers and public servants. You're basically making sure that the Chinese whispers transmit your evidence-based research with high fidelity. Consultants, peak bodies, advocacy groups. So advice comes in two types: solicited and unsolicited. Solicited advice is primarily given by consultants, and unsolicited advice is given by the annoying advocacy groups. So impact here looks like the entity you are trying to influence trusting your opinions and recommendations. It looks like helping governments see how they can achieve their goals and happen to achieve your impact goals at the same time. Politicians, political staffers, and the media, all key players in deciding what policies are followed. This is also where the general public interfaces with policy. Impact here is fairly obvious. Use your political campaign, or maybe become politicians. Most policy is interpreted by state and federal public servants. And impact here is positioning yourself in a place in government or other huge decision-making organization where you're pretty confident that 1% of your work will pay for the 99% of your other work. And floating around in the policy process, I'll call these the large international organizations, UN, UNICEF, Gates Foundation, all that. Impact here looks like global coordination. We care about issues that require global coordination, so they need to be this work. And the last sort of policy group I'll talk about is the EA ecosystem. As a collective in EA organizations and grant-based work, we create policy research and advocate for those recommendations. And I think impact here looks pretty obvious. It's whatever the theory of change is, and we love a good theory of change. The last note that I'll make here is that during the course of a policy career, people often find themselves moving around. So this is the thing: don't aim for the EA ecosystem. Go find policy mentorship elsewhere. Bring your EA mindset to each of those 4 functions, and don't silo yourself. You have so much to learn and give.
Thanks. And so just to finish up, I just wanted to make a note that, a lot has changed since EAGX 2022, and that's largely just because people have put their hands up to get involved. And so here's some images from a great AI policy submissions event that ran that shows this. I think the global EA policy community always needs more people who are driven to make an impact, and also able to straddle both the policy and the EA worlds. I hope this talk gives you some ideas about how you can consider your fit for this space. So a quick final plug, Chelsea and I have office hours tomorrow at 11 o'clock. So feel free to come and see us there. You can contact us on Swapcard. I am active on Swapcard regularly, including after the conference, and also email us at those emails there. We're happy to take any questions.
One question.
Thanks so much, Chelsea and Krystal. That was absolutely fascinating. I think we might be out of time for questions, unfortunately. But folks in the audience, please catch up with Krystal and Chelsea at office hours, and also and so on, as you said. And let's give Krystal one more round of applause.